I hope you have been enjoying our series, our town hall series, Love is an Action Word, co-sponsored by the Reconciliation Ministry and Reverend April Johnson and the Office of General Minister and President. Tonight's session includes a panel of multiple voices from across our church. If you want to see the previous panels, they are available on our website on disciples.org and also on the Christian Church Disciples of Christ YouTube channel. We certainly hope that these series of honest family conversations have prompted you to have your own conversations, to do your own learning within your congregations, within your family. And because we continue to affirm that we must become an anti-racism, pro-reconciliation church, the work doesn't end here. This has only been the beginning to perhaps replow the ground and sow some seeds for the work that's ahead. So thank you for your support of these very important conversations. Hope is an orientation, John Lewis, I think, said. And so we don't end here. This is part of the journey of the work that we simply must do to make justice happen, as Lisa Davison translates Micah 6:8, to make justice happen, to love passionately as the Holy loves, and to be the image of the divine in the world. So thank you to all of our panelists tonight. And I'd now like to turn it over to our moderator for the evening, our Minister of Reconciliation, Reverend April Johnson, whose ministry is devoted to ensuring that we can be the church that we say we are, an anti-racism, pro-reconciliation church. So Reverend April, thank you for your help in curating this series. We also want to acknowledge, at least I want to acknowledge the Reverend Yvonne Gilmore, who has helped to curate this series from the beginning, soon to be the interim administrative secretary of the National Convocation. So we thank her, and we also thank Reverend April for your hard work in putting this series together. So I'll turn it over to Reverend April, and may the Spirit open our hearts and minds to receive this conversation. God bless.
Bless you, Terry. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us tonight in our town hall, Love is an Action Word. Tonight's theme is identity, theology, and care for the community. And it is my honor to serve in this capacity tonight as your moderator and to be in company of these amazing panelists that we have with us on tonight for Love is an Action Word. Our panelists are all pastors. So we have a panel of pastors with us tonight, which is perfect for our theme, care for the community. We hope, as we have been in the past, to have a family dialogue. And as the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, sometimes we are a family bush more so than a family tree. And we welcome that spirit into our webinar on tonight. Just a few housekeeping items for you. If you are viewing us on Facebook Live tonight, your comments will be monitored and they will be addressed in the last 15 minutes of our time together tonight. And if you are watching us through our webinar program through Zoom, your comments can be posted in the chat, and those also are being monitored, and we will share those in our question and answer segment. The other thing I want to remind you all of is this medium, the Zoom platform, is a platform that goes into perpetuity. So we want to govern ourselves accordingly. We can be honest about who we are as the family of the Christian Disciples of Christ. But if we can do that with integrity and love, that would be wonderful for this forum. As well, we want to make sure that we hear stories from our panelists. And so let's be clear as panelists and participants that we author our own stories. Our stories belong to us. And so if we have a question about someone's story, or we have something we want to share, if we can share from our own narrative as opposed to the narrative of someone else, that would be amazing. And I think that ends our housekeeping so that we can get right to our time together. Hopefully our conversation will be so lively that we will actually run out of time. So I want to introduce our panelists this evening. I'll start with Pastora Bere Hilsoto. She is the pastor of Iglesia Hermandad in Indianapolis. And a fun fact about Bere, instead of reading her bio, is that recently her and her husband, Ronnie Bell, have acquired a puppy named Kingston. So Kingston has rearranged their entire life, my understanding. Next on our panel, on my Hollywood Square here is Reverend Brian Gerard, and he is the senior minister of First Christian Church in Louisville, Kentucky. And a fun fact about Brian is that if you Google Brian, you will find that he is a Swedish reality show champion. So do Google Brian. But more importantly, Google First Christian Church in Louisville. You will find out some amazing activism work that is happening in that town. Next on my Hollywood Square is Reverend Alan Dickin. And Alan is the program manager for the region of Ohio, former pastor of Carthage Christian Church there in Cincinnati. And a fun fact about Alan is that for the love of the church and week of compassion, Brian shaved his COVID beard half clean and left the half intact, waiting on a donor to make a full commitment. That is commitment to compassion and the life of the church. And finally, on our panel today is Reverend Margie Pride. Margie is the former pastor of Memorial Boulevard Christian Church in St. Louis, Missouri. She is enjoying her 7th month of retirement, I believe. Just 6?
Not quite. April.
7. It's October.
All right.
And she will be headed to Guatemala as soon as air and travel restrictions are lifted because of her passion for justice and her work in that region through Week of Compassion as well. So we are grateful for all of you participating with us tonight. And I want to open with our first question, which is, how has your community or congregation been impacted by this moment, this racial justice crisis, and this COVID-19 global pandemic? Betty, will you start?
Yes, I think that this question hits really hard in our community because the people that I serve and the people that I grow with in faith were greatly impacted during this COVID season and the racial tensions also that we've been experiencing as a nation. Depending on where in which stage of their immigration journey people were, a lot of my folks at church were, they faced an impediment of access to governmental assistance. We know that government was providing unemployment. They were also offering the stimulus check, and none of those resources were accessible to the people I serve. So a lot of my folks also, because they are the expendables, sadly, in this system, capitalist and racist system in which we live in, given the lack of 9 magical numbers, their job was insecure. So they were the first ones to be furloughed or simply just fired. And so they, on top of being fired within a pandemic, they didn't have jobs to pay for their bills, their needs. They were not able to access unemployment, and they did not receive a stimulus check that offset some of their expenses. So that was quite the first phase of how this season impacted my community. The loss of jobs during the pandemic, as I said, it was really sad when I would talk with my colleagues, and the situation was quite different among congregations and among other ministers. And then on top of that, at least in our state, in our city, a lockdown happened. And so a state mandate of stay at home was issued. And if you had to go out to work, you needed to, prove, have some proof that your your work was providing. So sure, that's no problem. But then if a police officer stops you and asks you, where are you going? The first thing that they're going to ask you is not your work permit, but your license. And a lot of my folks at church do not have a license, a driver's license. So sure, they were able to go to work, but what if a police officer stops me and asks me, why am I out during a lockdown time? And so even though they were able to go to their job, there was the fear of an imminent deportation, because right now, given the political status of our nation and the way that immigration laws are being treated, pretty much any reason that the police officer would stop anyone would create a court case, and that immediately can become a deportation. So fear of going to work, but at the same time need of going to work, and the lockdown, as I said, was impacting all of our community, and then the lack of access in Spanish. Some of them were still in need of going to their regular medical appointments or new medical appointments that were surfacing in our congregation. About 10% of our congregants were diagnosed positive. Two of them almost were at the verge of losing their life. And then there comes the piece of whether I go to the hospital, to the emergency room, and will there be an interpreter? Will I be taken serious? There were not as many interpreters, and then the interpreters in Spanish that were present were not as good or as efficient for them. They would give them information, half information, so they would not get the full attention that they needed. And as the media, was distracting us with, of course, COVID was real, and it's still real, and it's very eminent, the risk that we go through. However, I think that media took it to the opposite end and started just covering 24/7 news about COVID, statistics, and infunding, fear in people, when there's a lot of stuff politically that is happening that was not being covered, that people needed to know. We were going and starting into this political season of elections, soon to the end of this season. And at the same time, just recently a government, and that just hit home also tremendously, knowing that some of my own congregants were at some point in detention centers. Women and girls were at detention centers at some point. Just learning from the news that I look for, that detention centers were performing hysterectomies on women and girls. While COVID is also happening, while they are not being treated when positive within detention centers, those things are not talked about, and people don't really know them. And for me, just, all those things were, I think, at least some of the things that can come up to mind when I think of how this season of pandemic and racial tensions have affected my community, and how can a government who pronounces themselves to be pro-life be doing such things like killing Black people on the streets, or doing unlawful procedures, surgical procedures on girls within detention centers. So I can stop there because I was the first one, so I don't want to go down, and I want my colleagues also to share. But those are the things that were coming up to mind.
Right?
Yeah, first I just want to give thanks for the previous webinars of the series. It's been a great series, and those that I've seen, I'm so grateful for everyone who has shared their stories, the vulnerability, the bravery, the willingness to offer selves. Bear's story is a perfect example of this. I think it's just essential that in order to reach reconciliation, we have to hear truth first. Truth has got to come before reconciliation. And sometimes it's hard to hear truth and it's hard to receive it and accept it. And I think some folks want to press back against that. And I understand that inclination. But I'm grateful for the people who've been a part of this series who have agitated us and pressed us against those tendencies. And so grateful for them and for the office of the General Minister and President and for Reconciliation Ministries and you, April, for doing this. Here in Louisville, Kentucky, my hometown, we've been we've been impacted by the Breonna Taylor case. This is right in our backyard, and it has impacted us significantly. And our community continues to be stirred and troubled by this, and with details continuing to come out from the grand jury and what was said and what wasn't said, what was offered and what wasn't offered. There just seems to be more murkiness there and more questions. And I think once again, there's some concerns about justice. And is that going to come? And what does that look like? And how do we attain that? And again, just the overarching fears of lack of trust and lack of transparency. And what does that mean? And that's a power dynamic. And how do we trust and how do we seek truth? And so in our community right now, we're dealing a lot with that, of course, with COVID. And I think was speaking with someone recently about this. COVID has got us at home and we're focused on things in a way we aren't always focused on. And I think we're focused on Breonna right now here in our community. And we want to see some outcome there. We want to see how this turns out. And so it has impacted our community in a lot of ways. Personally, I do want to just a part of my story and where I am. I have a son who my wife and I adopted at birth. He is multiracial. He is Mexican-American, African-American, and Caucasian. If you met him on the street, he would present to you likely as African-American, dark skin, just over 6 foot tall, dreadlocks down past his shoulder. He's 20 years old and is a junior in college. So our journey as a white family, being parents of someone who presents as a young African-American male, has been tremendously impacted by that. While that has shaped me for sure, I am still a white, straight male, cisgender straight male in the world and live predominantly in a place of privilege. I have not certainly experienced what my son has experienced or what other people of color and in marginalized communities have experienced, but he has been a great teacher to me. And I continue to be a learner as he walks me along what it is like to be in that situation. And I think this has become particularly true and poignant in this moment. We have so many stories, like so many families and people of color and people who are part of a marginalized community who have experienced injustice and hardship and racism and bigotry. He had an experience in high school. He was about 16 years old, and it was just another racial dust up. And I tried to offer him care as his father, and we sat down and just said, "Son, I'm so sorry. I'm just so sorry that you have to experience this." And he said, "Dad, it's okay. I'm used to it." Mm. That just that laid me out. Nobody should be used to that. Nobody should be in a place where they have experienced bigotry and bias enough by the age of 16 that they are used to it. Nobody should be used to this. Those who perpetrate it and those who experience it. And that moment broke my world open in a way that nothing I've ever experienced had. And I needed some time after that. So we've come a long way, folks, but we got a long ways to go. And I'm grateful to be a small part of the larger church's journey in that.
Amen. Margie.
Well, I've been retired now for 6.5 months. The community I served, Memorial Boulevard Christian Church, was in 98% Black neighborhood in the north side of the city of St. Louis. I feel a little bit out of the loop at this point with that community, but they have continued to try to serve the needs of the people who are largely, well, increasingly we had reached out to people who are homeless, addicted, ex-offenders. And I think that it's just gotten worse. It's harder than it's ever been for people in the community. Violence is up, and that's not new. The violence on the street in poor neighborhoods is pretty devastating. The reality of struggling to make one's life livable day to day is pretty horrific a good bit of the time from my perspective. And what Memorial was able and is able to do has been small meals, hot meals to the community twice a week, shower facilities, food. So a lot of times it feels like you're just doing Band-Aid kind of work, and at the same time, it may be what gives people what they need to keep going and the meal that keeps them alive day to day. I know they're keeping on, and they have had to greatly reduce their ability to reach out into the community because of COVID. So they're doing services every couple weeks outside. They're also serving meals to the community along with food on Thursdays, but they've really had to cut back. They're online, but they've really had to cut back to the community services as a rule. For me, I'm still kind of in transition and had the luxury of visiting lots of different churches and feeling as if I'm still trying to figure out who I am in this period of transition from active pastorate to retired pastorate, and what God's call for me is on my life in terms of justice work. I've been able to work with Reverend April Johnson and the core trainers to continue to do some core training for the Anti-Racism Church and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, and that's been good. It continues to be life-giving, and I'm grateful to be able to have some time to continue to do that. I have had the privilege of watching each of the town hall meetings and found myself coming away with my sister. We said every time, wow, we've got a lot still to learn. So that's where I am.
Reverend Allen?
Yes. So, how has the community that I'm a part of been impacted? I serve the regional church in Ohio, but up until the beginning of this month, I had been serving a local church in Cincinnati, and I had talked with the board at the very beginning of the year about this call coming to a close, and we had talked about wanting to announce that to the church sometime in mid-March. Well, we all know the best laid plans. And so the community that I was serving at the church had to go through the entire transition of me leaving. I'd been serving there a little over 7 years, and to go through that whole transition online and virtually was certainly a challenge. And that was difficult, but it was it was also remarkable to see how quickly the church was able to pivot. And we had been working for a long time on setting up online giving, and coincidentally, the same week that we canceled in-person services was the week that we had uploaded online giving. So that helped. But I think, as had been mentioned before, so many of the effects of COVID-19 helped people to kind of pare down a little some of the distractions and to focus in a little bit more on what was important to them. So in some ways, we saw a greater response to some of our church activities and conversations because people were really needing that community. They felt that they needed to be a part of that. And then also what we found So I should preface this that in saying that I'm a big believer in protesting. So I protest about as often as disciples take communion. So at the drop of a hat. I've been to Ferguson, Louisville recently. Kind of that is part of what I believe is my call as a pastor, and especially as a cis straight white male pastor, that there's so much privilege afforded to me in those scenarios that I can be present and witness without the same kind of risks. So I've been doing this for a while, and the church where I served was supportive of it, but rarely would they join. And what we found after everything in May, well, I mean, everything that led up to what we've experienced. It certainly wasn't just George Floyd or Breonna Taylor or Ahmaud Arbery. It has been and continues to be, a litany. But people from the congregation where I was serving wanted to come and be present in the protest. They knew I'd be there. They didn't say, "Hey, are you thinking of protesting? Can I join you?" They said, "When you go down, is it okay if we meet up with you?" And to see college kids and whole families would come, and it was especially poignant, I think, that we hadn't been physically together in the sanctuary for months, but these people were yearning for ways to be the church. And that for them was a way that they could be the church. And I think it pushed them in ways that they might not have otherwise, um, to look outside of maybe what they were comfortable with. Um, uh, and that's not to I think we need to be clear sometimes when I talk about protesting during a pandemic. There are, of course, health concerns and reasons why folks may not feel comfortable doing that. But there have been a lot of reasons to protest before COVID happened. And so pretending like that's the only reason why we're not out there may be a little disingenuous. So it's been interesting to see the church in Cincinnati respond and start to change some of the ways they worship on Sunday mornings, but also change some of the ways that they try to be the church more publicly outside of the sanctuary. And I think it's part of a lot of what we've been talking about and working on as a congregation, and part of the journey where they will continue to go. But yeah, that's been certainly a year and circumstances that have pushed, I think, the church to really, and when I say that, I mean the local church, but also the church as the larger church, to really articulate what it is, what we mean when we say we're the church, and how do we act that out? Because the traditional ways of us being church are no longer viable in this, in in both plagues of COVID and racism. And so how are we going to change the way that we do church? And I think what the church in Cincinnati where I serve is just an example of that. But I'm also serving as the regional program director in Ohio and seeing many churches wrestling with those same questions, just in a way that they maybe hadn't before. Really trying to dig in around what it means to be church now.
Amen. Amen. It makes me think that so there's been some anxiety, heightened anxiety. We're already pretty anxiety-rich nation, and likely church. And COVID and the racial justice crises has kind of thrown us, like you said, into new ways of being church. So I'm wondering if you all could share with our audience, how has your theology around being church, as we invite people to be a part of this community, we typically don't lead with a Bible tract, right? Especially in these kind of times, we know we lead with meeting needs, as Margie talked about. How do we feed people maybe the only meal of the day? How has your theology shifted in the midst of these two pandemics? Brian, you want to start?
Sure. For us, it's been an ongoing process that I would say began before COVID, but dealing just with the issues of race and issues around that, and also issues around making sure that we are leveraging our situation, predominantly white congregation in a rather affluent part of Louisville. One of the things we can leverage our financial resources. And so what does that mean for us? And so when I think of love as an action word, one of the things that has meant for us is to restructure our budgeting so that we could leverage our financial resources and get those things out the door. We are not a tremendously large church, but in 5 years, we've distributed over $250,000 to other organizations in the great work that they're doing, including reconciliation ministry and some things in our church, but also just other organizations that are out there making the world a better place. And one of the places we focused on, and the areas we focused on, are issues of community health and racial justice and economic empowerment and things like that. I'm not real too comfortable with that word of empowerment, because we don't need to empower anyone. They can empower themselves. They've already got their power. But so I'll pull that back just a little bit. So what we've done is we've really tried to make sure that we're helping to fund educational opportunities, travel opportunities, health initiatives, different things in our community that are allowing people to get the resources that they need, that they may not be able to get on their own. And this isn't just an issue that we've worked with the African American community here in Louisville. We've also made some partnerships with the Muslim community here in Louisville, and have built a tremendous partnership with the Muslim community. We partner with them in local outreach, in serving at a community emergency shelter, for example. We join them for an iftar annually. We have fellowship events with youth and adults. We work alongside each other. Our church has hosted anti-Islamic training sessions for clergy. We helped fund an event at University of Louisville that was anti-Islamophobia training event here in Louisville at the university. And so one of the things that we've done just in terms of our theological approach is really to try to leverage what one of our strengths and what we have. And money isn't everything. Let's be clear. You need to be engaged. You need to be active. But money can leverage some things, and money can make a difference. And so we've restructured our budget, and we've started sharing those resources in a way that we are hoping is impacting our community beyond ourselves. And I think that is a very action-oriented expression of love in the way that we can do that. And I do think it's opening our hearts, because as we do that, we are also forming relationships. And as we form those relationships, this community in northeastern Jefferson County and Louisville is beginning to see the world beyond our own doors. And that opens us up in ways that wasn't happening before. And while that's shifted with COVID, those relationships are still there. Those things are still mattering. And because of the generosity of our church, we were able to reopen our process of distributing funds. It was later in the year this year, but we were able to do that. And so those things are continuing to happen. And so that has felt very transformative for us. And it's also felt action oriented for us, which I think is a theological shift, taking those things and resourcing them in some productive ways.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I Reconciliation has been a recipient of what First Christian in Louisville calls wholeness grants. Mm-hmm. And really theology and practice, or practical theology. If you are to go into the walls of that church, you will see in black and white photo montage of the ways in which practical theology is occurring outside of the church. So everyone who receives a wholeness grant has a picture of them in action, and those pictures go in the sanctuary, which again is a wonderful way to start it before COVID, but seems to have some embodiment in COVID, when we can't go inside the sanctuary and see what we should be doing and what we could be doing. So anybody else? Bede? Practical theology, how has it shifted during this?
I think that the very name of this series calls us to it. And since I got invited to this panel, I just kept pondering on reflecting on the name of it. Love is an action word, and not love is an act. There's a difference between an action and an act. An act seems to me to be just a one-time thing, which, to be honest, sometimes as a church, we are very good at that. We just give one time, we just do one time a thing, and we feel good because we did our part. But when we think on action, it means a constant. It's a movement. And hello, as disciples, we're a movement. We're not an act. We are a movement of wholeness. And I think that that's part of what has been a learning for me during this season of COVID, and on top of COVID pandemic, the racial tensions that have happened. Sorry, not racial tensions. The racial oppression, overt racial oppression that have been occurring around the nation. The church, in my understanding, we need to stop just doing acts. We need to begin acting, begin engaging. And as someone who loves the Old Testament, I just think of the very Genesis story, and when God says it is not good for human beings to be alone. We think that the actions or the acts need to be done by one person, by one church, by one congregation. So we get, the headline of the regional newspaper, or we make it to the Disciples News, and it's really not about who gets the glory, but about who gets not served, but who gets uplifted back to their humanity. I guess I hope I'm not preaching, but as someone, again, who loves the Old Testament, just think of when Jeremiah tells God's word to the people and says, in the well-being of this land, or this new land, you will find your well-being. And how as a church, we used to be so selfish. We used to think of our own well-being, as Brian was saying, that our budget, we still on the black, we don't go to the red, and we do things. We have a beautiful report with all sorts of places and people that we have served. But how many times have we really engaged and realized that we are more than just an insular institution, and that there are kids dying in the street in cages, women crossing deserts with babies in their backpacks, trying to seek for a better life somewhere. And how the church involved in all that? Do we even mention that at church, or do we leave that? Do we leave the racial stuff to the Black churches to talk about, and then the immigration stuff to immigrant congregations to talk about? And where does the interconnectivity come? And I think that as a congregation, that a lot of their identity falls into social minorities by the system. I think that even ourselves, we have to also realize that we are not just victims or mission of the church. We are the church, and we can do something, and we need to start those relationships that will heal the wounds that the evil in this world is causing us to think that we need to do this by ourselves, or someone's fight is their fight, and it's not a joint fight, but we need to be in this together. And I think that that's part of what has been happening, at least in my personal life and as a ministry, and even within our congregation as church. We've realized we even went through a revamping of our logo and stopped being insular, and just show with our image that we are doing the work of going out and being one family as we're supposed to. So yeah, still a lot of work to do and to learn, but I think that that's somehow the ways that I've been impacted and transformed.
Man. Anybody else? Alan.
Yeah, thinking about how theology has shifted, I think about how, we talk a lot about the living God and the presence of God in our lives, but I would say that this year has felt more biblical for people. It's one thing to read about Noah and the ark and 40 days, and that's that's what a quarantine is. It's 40 days. And we hit 40 days a long time ago. And then you go back and you reread the story that is very familiar, and you all of a sudden these numbers jump out at you that not you, I'll just speak for myself, that I didn't really pay as much attention to. I pay attention to that 40 days and 40 nights, and then I read, oh, and it's months before they send out that first bird, and it's over a year before they get off the ark, that the flooding happens, but it takes over a year before they get off. And that just I think we're reminded that this has happened to God's people before, and God has been present, and God is with us now, and it just feels much bigger than if we were to read that same story in 2019. And I think something that's been helpful, the church in Cincinnati where I've served, Carthage is a pretty diverse congregation actually, but it predominantly white churches, I would say, are starting to recognize, and I think some of this language around pandemic and some of this focus has helped waken white congregations to the need, as has been said before, for action, ongoing action. And I'm going to borrow this from a pastor friend of mine in the city, Damon Lynch III. So in case anybody sees this, this is not an Alan Dickin original. This is from Damon Lynch III. But he talks about how we read the Exodus narrative, and we read about people who, for 40 years keep moving forward because they believe in the promised land. And that's 40 years in a desert. And they don't know when that time is going to end, but they know that they have to take their steps so that the next generation can get closer to that promised land. And when we think about whether it's a pandemic or racism, it can feel like just such a massive desert that it just feels almost impossible to get all the way to the promised land. But we believe in God's promise, and we believe that God will bring us through to the promised land. And so I think white congregations believed that they were farther along than they were. And I think that we're recognizing that there's a difference between, when you're liberated from Pharaoh and you get away from Egypt, that's good. But I think white congregations just felt like, well, we've done enough, and have now been having their eyes open to the idea of just how in the wilderness, in that desert we are, and how important it is for us to take our steps to get through the wilderness, to get to that promised land. It sounds, to some people, it sounds silly, to say, I believe that we will be one day in a world without racism. I do believe that. Yeah. And I think that sounds so far from this truth of where we are today that it just sounds unbelievable. We have a God who does unbelievable things. And it's going to take the work of the church, the work of the people. God doesn't bring the promised land to where the people are in the desert. The people have to go through. They have to take their steps. And so we, whether or not I live to see that promised land, I believe in a God who makes that promise, which means I have to take my steps. And I think that theology, that imagining of theology, puts the impetus on us to move and act now. And I think we're having a harder time saying this doesn't involve me, or this isn't an issue, or our church is fine, or we can do it the way we've always done it, because we're waking up to just how biblical this moment is and how much is required of us to really live out our Christian faith. And I think that is in some ways exciting, but of course really awful that it's taken what it's taken for us to start to move through the desert better.
Margie.
Well, I guess I'm getting into ecclesiology and what it means to be church, but I've mentioned that ever since I retired, I've visited online all different church every Sunday. Practically, I've revisited some. I need to get into some Hispanic community, so I confess I haven't done that. So send me your information because it isn't always easy to get into these Facebook pages. I just have to
Oh,
say
I'm
that.
emailing you right now.
Okay, good. Barre, I look forward to it. But one of the things that strikes me is that it's still what Martin Luther King Jr. said, Dr. King said, one of the most, if not the most segregated hour is Sunday morning worship. Memorial Boulevard with Webster Grove is the most diverse I've seen, but by and large, we're not worshiping together. And that is discouraging to me. How do we, as Christian Church Disciples of Christ, facilitate movement without patronizing, without disenfranchising communities that need to be together for sustenance and courage? I'm not exactly sure how that happens. Just let me say that's a concern. The other concern I have is that online service is just wonderful for those of us who have access to online services, but there are huge numbers of people who are poor in this country, and especially of people of color who have no access to these worship services, and they're not getting, I mean, I just don't, I mean, I guess there are some ways people are getting it. I know people can get things on their phone, but I'm just lifting that up as a deep concern. You know, how do we touch people when we can't even touch them anymore, when we can't be present to one another? How do we make those inroads? And that's a terrific injustice as we think about community across these town hall meetings. One of the things that keeps coming up to me is how do these begin the conversations that can begin to dismantle the injustices within our own denomination and within the church in general, so that when we speak the word, the people can hear that we're living the word? And we're still working on that. I'm still working on that. I mean, I confess I'm not there, but I'm just saying those are some of the injustices I see as I walk through. At the same time, Public Radio just did an incredible piece on Inside Appalachia called Black Lives Matter, Black Lungs. And I recommend you see it because it begins to make some connections across race and class that are important for us to make. And we just need to keep doing that. And we haven't acknowledged the LGBTQ community here tonight that also deals with devastating injustices that include people of color. So those are some.
And if I can piggyback on what you were saying, Margie, I think that it's so true. And as a pastor, I don't know if those watching us right now want to be really honest, but once the pandemic started and all of us were forced to fully go virtual, then the war on who does it better, and then who does the fanciest transitions and audio and everything. And so we started spending so much money and effort in doing a virtual worship experience than attending to those in our own communities, perhaps even within our own congregations that, as you were mentioning, cannot access worship. And worship for them might be just a simple phone call, call to pray with them, visit and say, have you been fed this week? Do you have money to pay your rent? Because I think that tithes and offerings need to be also put into tangible ways. And so it's, don't get me wrong, I'm a perfectionist, and some of you, Reverend Johnson, knows that. And I do like electronic things, and I think that's great that we're being able to reach far, way beyond the scope that we were initially doing. But is that what we're called right now to do as a church, to have the fanciest worship experience online? or to be the church where people need to be fed, where Jews are being kicked out of their homes during a pandemic because they finally came out to their parents and their parents said, nope, cannot love you like this. Like, I don't know, I'm just gonna, but just wanted to reply to what you said, Margie, that just so fibers in me.
This is rich. This is really good because this, we try to close this session with the question of what concrete ideas or things that we can do to eradicate racism, right? And when we talk about racism, the Poor People's Campaign always talks about, the interlocking oppressions, so often when I do presentations, especially now, I'm doing way more presentations online than I was doing in person. That's April Johnson, Reconciliation Minister. Anyway, so I'm doing a lot more presentations online, but the issue is, I get questioned all the time. One is, what can we do about this? Because it can be overwhelming, right? It can be so overwhelming, particularly for people who don't talk about this in polite conversation. And the other piece is that, are you saying that the theological and practical implications of racism cannot be applied to other oppressions? And we're never saying that, right? And part of the trick of this work is to throw us off and have us focus on that these oppressions are not interlocking and cause us to be overwhelmed and back away from the work. So I guess I want to ask you guys 2 questions, and you can answer whichever one you want to. And that is, what inspires you or gives you hope in this season? Maybe it's a scripture, maybe it's feeding people. And then the other is, what concrete ways that you are either already or are looking forward to doing to help us eradicate and dismantle these interlocking oppressions? Alan, you look like you're chomping at the bit.
I got so excited I hit my mute button and I knocked my phone down. So I think it's my answer to that would be actually an answer to both questions. So, and this is not, it's going to sound cheesy and corny, but my hope is actually conversations like this. And I genuinely believe conversations like this will help in a concrete way, because of the exact issues that Margie had brought up. Because a predominantly white congregation is not going to be worshiping with people that are not white. It's hard to make that happen organically. It's hard to do it in ways that bear fruit. And so what we can do, however, in these kind of conversations is be reminded that we are part of the church universal. And that just because the church where one may worship may be 99% white, they are still part of a denomination that is not 99% white. And we can work together, have conversations, be in relationship with one another in ways that remind us of that can open us up to conversation, to confrontation, and to pushing those of us who are in more comfortable spaces. And I speak about in 2 white churches because that is who I am. If I'm talking about anti-racism work, that's the group that I need to be addressing. So what we can do is we can listen in these spaces and be pushed and be uncomfortable. We, in Ohio, we had a clergy statement that was very strong. It used very strong language around defunding the police, and it was theologically framed. And I guarantee you that there are churches and pastors who, in a predominantly white church, would not be able to formulate that kind of a statement, would not be able to pass that around their congregation. But because we did it throughout the whole state, we were able to come together to learn from the leadership of our anti-racism team, the Black pastors who helped write it, and to share it with congregations that otherwise probably wouldn't have been having those specific conversations with clergy who might not have those words to use in their congregations. And so that is my hope. And I think something that is concrete is when we have conversations like this, we are opened up to being able to hear from other perspectives, to learn from others, and to be able to challenge ourselves then and what we need to be working on, to transform in our ministry, to make sure, as Bere had said, that it's not just Black churches talking about racial justice or immigrant churches talking about immigration, that this is part of the church. And when we see it more as the church instead of just my congregation, then we become a more faithful representation of the whole body of Christ. And so that's what I think is both hopeful and concrete, that we can continue this kind of shared work together across individual congregations.
Awesome. Awesome. Brian, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, Alan, I really appreciate that, and I think conversations don't have to be perfect, and I think that that's some of what white folk and white congregations, we're trying to figure out how to do this, and we don't know how to do it, and it feels. I think one of our knee-jerk reactions is to try to bring in people of color to help us have that conversation. It's not their job to do the work for us. We've got to do our own work, but we're afraid we're going to mess it up, and so we don't do it. It's okay to do it and not do it perfectly. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to fall short. You're going to have some fits and starts, and that's okay. That's grace, and that's growth. And it's okay. And so I think you're right. I think conversation is key, and it's really important. A thing of hope I saw recently at a protest rally gathering. It was in the middle of a Sunday afternoon. It was predominantly middle-aged white folks in their masks, all socially distant and really quiet. And initially, as we were talking about it, someone said to me, it feels so discouraging because there's no people of color. Where are all the people of color? It's just all these white folk who come down to this safe space and we're, what are we doing? But all of the people who spoke and led were from communities of color and marginalized communities. And there's this moment where I'm standing there and I'm watching hundreds of white folk listen and be led by people of marginalized communities. And it was one of the most hope-filled moments I've seen. First, that they showed up. Second, that they were wearing masks and social distancing. But third, that they were listening. They were being led by people from marginalized communities, which I think for many of them was new. And it was powerful and it was amazing. And I do think that this moment is waking up the white church in a way that needs to happen. And so I find hope in that. And I find the grace of Christ in the midst of that. And that keeps, you can tell, that keeps me leaning into this process, even if imperfectly, because I've certainly made my share of mistakes along the way.
We have 2 minutes left, and I'm going to add one last question before we close, and that is, it's the lightning round. Okay, so one word, and that is, what word of hope, if we've got some of that, or challenge or charge do you offer the church, the Christian church or the Church Universal, as we lean in and take from and learn from this moment for our shared future? One word. Popcorn.
Believe.
That's for preachers.
Believe.
Pastora?
Flesh.
Flesh. Yes.
I have to say love.
I'm going to go with provoke.
Yes. Well, I am provoked and I am inspired by each of you. I have a different relationship with all of you. I'm grateful for that. And I hope to have introduced the church to all of you to share your gifts, your insights, but your hope. And Brian mentioned being agitated. And the grant that I received from First Christian in Louisville was to help us to launch our One Bag of Tea One Conversation program. And the purpose of that program is to just do that. Brian said earlier, I don't want to just keep calling you, but Brian said earlier that we can't have reconciliation before you have truth. And we can't agitate people unless we are in relationship. And so I was grateful to receive that, but I'm also reaffirmed in our conversation tonight that we have to show up for the types of conversations that give Alan hope and to give me hope, so that we can agitate each other in love and that we can embody the flesh of Christ. It's not our budgets, Brian. It's not which oppression is going to win the Olympics over the other oppressions. It is, how do we embody the love of Christ? And I wear this necklace. I did not wear this as a prop tonight, I promise you. But I wear this necklace. It's a heart and a cross. And I don't wear crosses. I didn't wear crosses till I started wearing a lot of jewelry. And they make some really fancy crosses these days. Who knew? But this particular one is a heart, and the cross goes through it. So I think about, in my own theology, and I don't expect everyone to share this theology, is that when we think about love is an action word, that the ultimate action of love is the one by which we bear the name of Christian. We are Christ beloved because we love one another as hard as it is, in and through these difficult reminders that we are the one body of Christ. We are not the same, but we are the one body of Christ. And so I charge those of you who are listening tonight to continue to be in the conversation, to continue to be on the work toward truth, so that we might agitate each other, that love might be the action, that those who do not know the saving and the loving acts of Christ will come to know Christ because of our love that produces reconciliation. Thank you all so much for being our panelists tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. May we stay on the journey to do the good and pleasing work of Christ. Amen. And good night.
And thank you, Reverend April. Thank you all. It was lovely to be with you.
All right. Bye-bye.